invited him back for a second time, which is an honor that seldom gets bestowed on our speakers. We usually have people just once a semester or so, but he has a very interesting topic that we look forward to learning more about. Shakeel grew up nearby in Sanford, North Carolina, and came a little bit closer to Durham as he began his studies, went to UNC Chapel Hill, majored in political science and history. Then he came to Duke, earned a degree from Divinity School, and now he's at Louisiana State University pursuing his interests in history. So he will be sharing with us insights from the intersection of history and religion gone wrong or human nature gone wrong. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Once again, I want to say good morning to everyone and thank you for having me back. It's a tremendous honor. I don't take it for granted. And I'm excited because this time it's going to hopefully be even more exciting and hopefully you will learn something new. And so I'm going to now screen share so that we can begin our presentation. Let's see if this. All right, everyone see that? Okay, the title of our presentation this morning is What Now? Multicultural Mission Efforts After the Civil War and the Persistence of Racism. And this neat little title slide is a Contraband Camp, which we will learn more about in a minute, located at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. So this morning, we will examine the impact of some of the Civil War's most important laws. We will go through the rise and development of contraband camps. We will learn about institutional and individual approaches to domestic mission efforts among newly emancipated Black people. And finally, we will end this presentation by looking at the experiences of three unique missionaries by the names of Sarah Jane Parker, Lucy Chase, and Susie King Taylor. Now let us turn briefly to the Civil War, which is kind of what I talked about last time. So kind of recapping some things. The man featured here, President Abraham Lincoln, played a pivotal part in the nation's bloodiest war. After all, it was his election that served as the launching pad for a Southern rebellious strike against the government. Lincoln won the 1860 election with no electoral votes from the South. And so this left the South feeling violated and ignored. I mean, if you could imagine today a presidential race where there were no electoral votes from the South to elect the winning president, and that's kind of how it would be, how it was during that time. When Civil War broke out in April of 1861, the nation was bitterly divided, but everyone expected things to get back to normal in just a short time, a few months. The emancipation of enslaved people was not on President Lincoln's agenda. In the beginning, the Lincoln administration held a very conservative policy in regards to the abolition of slavery. The president wanted to reassure Southerners that he only wanted to bring the Union back together. He was not aiming to threaten the South's most economically beneficial system. Even as troops fought and overtook Confederate posts, they were ordered by the commander-in-chief not to disrupt systems of slavery. There are even early accounts of enslaved people running to Union lines, only for their Southern owners to come and retrieve them later. And actually, many Union soldiers carried severe disdain for Black people because as the war continued, more people thought that the reason for all of the violence was these people. And so they began to hate them for losing relatives in the war. So while Lincoln held a conservative policy in the beginning, the Confederate States of America began to realize even more just how important slavery was to the nation's livelihood. By April of 1862, the Confederate government had put in place mandatory conscription laws, calling for all able-bodied white men between the ages of 17 and 50 to give military services. This increase in manpower on the battlefield left a shortage of manpower on the home front, which meant relying even more on the labor power of enslaved people. Furthermore, Confederate forces also relied on the enslaved to build fortifications for cities and important waterways, to serve as personal body servants to elite soldiers, to cook food, and to perform so many other duties. Now, as Lincoln came to see the importance of slave labor to the stability and preservation of the Confederacy, he began in attacking the institution of slavery from a tactical, strategic military perspective. By August of 1861, the president and his administration noticed that increasing numbers of enslaved people in charge of building fortifications for the Confederate Army were fleeing. Inspired by their escapes to Union lines, Lincoln authorized the first Confiscation Act. It forbade the return of slaves who worked for the Confederate Army. And it's important to note here that it was only those slaves who worked for the Confederate Army and were tied directly to the Confederate war efforts. In March of 1862, a second Confiscation Act was passed. It moved beyond enslaved persons working for the Army. This law declared that no Union troops could ever be used to return enslaved runaways again. Now, this was, of course, a major policy shift, since I just mentioned that early on, many Southern owners were easily able to enter Union lines and retrieve their enslaved people. Finally, the Lincoln administration reached a policy shift climax with the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was, of course, a war power executive order issued by the president that announced freedom for all slaves in Confederate territories. And this, of course, excluded enslaved people from the 4 slave states who fought with the Union during the war, and that is Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. The Emancipation Proclamation had a tremendous impact on Black people everywhere, those in the Confederacy and those outside in the Union. And it helped pretty much fuel what we will now turn to, which is contraband camps. So we will talk about the importance of contraband camps now. Pictured here is a group of formerly enslaved Black people at a contraband camp located in Cumberland Landing, Virginia. As Black people began fleeing into Union lines, they were given the title contraband. Now, this name goes back to the military tactic approach the Lincoln administration first employed in thinking about the enslaved. Now, these people with this title were still considered property, and as objects and not people, the term really worked to desensitize onlookers to the violence associated with the struggles of people in these camps. As more former slaves began to flee, contraband camps rose greatly. These camps were generally located on the edges of well-defended Union-occupied towns. There are about 100 in total throughout different locations during the Civil War. And these camp residents received housing, they received rations and clothing, and they even received medical care. Contraband camps were designed really to serve as temporary homes for thousands of these Black refugees. The housing situations, however, on many of these camps somewhat mirrored their former homes on plantations, and in some ways may have even been worse. The arrival of so many different people coming from different corners of the nation, gathering in closed spaces, had all the makings for a medical disaster. Some eyewitnesses on these camps reported sights of people living in old or decaying buildings or even outhouses. And there are some accounts even of people living in homes in groups of 12 or even 20 to a home. And as a result of this, the contraband camp spaces were ideal for the spread of diseases like smallpox, yellow fever, and lice. Now, while these camps did provide resources to Black refugees, the resources were often more than not inadequate. One woman who grew up in the contraband camps by the name of Huldah Williams recalled growing up as a child there in a contraband camp in Arkansas. And Huldah Williams remembered how Union soldiers would distribute one piece of firewood a day to every family represented so that they could make fire. And that was her experience in Arkansas. These soldiers were just as tight-gripped when it came to food rations. Contraband camps were deeply invested in working for the Union Army, not as invested as caring for enslaved people. Their main focus was to hurt the Confederacy by taking away resources from them that they knew they could use. And they were also inspired to help upkeep the Union Army. And because of this, many former slaves were able to experience being paid laborers for the first time. Many of them, when they came into the contraband camps that were located close to Union Army posts, they worked as builders, they worked as aides, nurses, cooks, and even washers, which is the picture right here on this slide is showing a group of people who are washing on behalf of the contraband camps working for the Union soldiers. Government officials in many of these camps wanted to ensure that the free people that were living in these spaces, these temporary living spaces, would not become lazy vagrants, and military leaders quickly put them to work, even if it was against their own will. According to one missionary working at Fort Monroe Contraband Camp in Virginia, which is this site was close to Norfolk, military officials issued a camp-wide order where he was on July 4th, 1863, impressing all able-bodied Black men. And this was in Norfolk and in the surrounding area of Fort Hampton. And this order sent them to Washington to work in the quartermaster's department. And it resulted in the forced migration of dozens of male refugees to Washington, D.C. Some men were pulled out of church services. Others were snatched off the streets. They weren't able to bring any clothes, tell their families goodbye. And they, for the duration of their working period, as long as they were needed, they were not able to come back to the camps where their families and friends were. It was also not unheard of throughout any of the camps for refugee workers to complain for not being compensated for their work. The missionary I just mentioned, Asa Prescott, he mentioned one newly freed laborer by the name of John Jordan. Jordan had spent 12 months working to build fortifications for the Union Army. And for his full year of labor, Jordan only received 86 cents. Another man named William Johnson spent 2 years working on and off at a Union Army hospital. And for his labor, he received no pay at all. Now, missionary Asa Prescott, who was sharing the stories of these men who were working and weren't getting paid, he wrote this letter in hopes that it would bring about a change. And whether it did or not, I don't know if it resulted in a change. His letter would make it to the highest ranking military officials in Virginia, which is pretty unique. So as the Union Army overtook and displaced Confederate troops and civilians, many former slaves were left in the wake, and others set out to flee their plantations in the midst of the chaos in hopes of gaining free status as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. More than this, though, contraband camps were spaces of forced integration. As seen in this picture, many of the former slaves often bartered on the side with soldiers and other camp members to add to their meals. With the less than stellar living conditions and resources provided for these refugees and their poor state, there was a large help or aid vacuum left. Who would fill it and how would they do it? And that leads us to mission efforts. So now we're going to begin to talk about the importance of mission efforts during the Civil War, and we will transition and look at their impact beyond the Civil War. So we will begin here by looking at the American Missionary Association. So the AMA was founded in 1846 and it was incorporated in 1849. They were created to, quote, send the gospel to those portions of our own and other countries which are destitute of it. And it's always that quote stands out to me because I think it becomes important to think about who we or who America considers as its own. And that will be important throughout the remainder of this presentation. Now, prior to the Civil War, the American Missionary Association spent a significant amount of its energy promoting anti-slavery efforts. But early on in the war, this association sent its first missionaries to contraband sites to Fort Monroe, which is the title slide site that I used on the opening slide. This is where they first sent their missionaries, and this was in September, just a few months after the war began of 1861. So the AMA became very vocal advocates for the rights and advancement of newly freed refugees, but they also carried a lot of the paternalistic impulses, which sometimes blinded their perspective concerning the daily struggles and challenges of these refugees, of these people. One AMA representative by the name of Reverend Mansfield French was sent to survey the camp at Port Royal, South Carolina. And it didn't take Reverend French long to note that people at the camp desperately needed financial relief and medical care. More than this, these people needed access to common means, quote, of civilization and enlightenment, unquote. One of the ways that the AMA sought to bring both of these qualities to free people was by creating and opening up schools within the contraband camps. Now, these schools were sites of education and exploration for both the Black refugees there, as well as the white missionaries who came to visit. Sabbath schools, as they were called, were maintained to give free people the religious training they lacked and so desperately needed. By October of 1864, in South Carolina, there were 31 AMA teachers and missionaries, and that was just in the state of South Carolina. These teachers and missionaries were responsible for operating 10 Sabbath schools. They had 800 pupils, and they even had 2 night schools for 300 adult students. So here, it is interesting to note that the AMA, in an 1862 issue of its quarterly magazine, The American Missionary, desperately urged its readers not to forget that domestic missions among the free people in the middle of a national civil war were not to be the main focus of the institution. While it was an American institution, indeed, it had global aims. Now, the editor here pleaded with donors saying, quote, "We hope the friends of missions will never forget that while home missions, and especially the ex-slaves and freedmen, claim their sympathy, our missionaries in foreign lands depend upon them, under God, for their prayers and pecuniary aid. In a time like this, the claims of foreign missions are in danger of being overlooked," unquote. After encouraging readers to remember those abroad, the editor then remarked on the state of affairs at Fort Monroe, the same place that missionary Asa Prescott described with less than favorable remarks. Now, this man found that, quote, "the authorities there were gratifyingly favorable to treating the people as free men," unquote. This is what some may consider a conflicting account. Be that as it may, the American Missionary Association did rise to the challenge in meeting many of the basic needs of these people, and they were being recognized for it. A New York newspaper, The Independent, produced an article on January 15, 1863, which is not long after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And the paper just basically credited the AMA with taking the lead in missionary operations among the thousands of late slaves already freed. The article highlighted association efforts in Kansas, Missouri, Virginia, Illinois, and even South Carolina. Now, the AMA was particularly proud of having commissioned 5 women teachers and 3 men. Now, of these 8 teachers, 2 would be preaching to the people, and they were both men. In addition to these people, there was a missionary couple that was en route to join them. The wife was an experienced teacher, and her expertise would prove especially helpful in carrying on the organization's work to educate and civilize. Now we will talk about something closer to home, that is the Methodist Church. Near the end of the war, one of the publishing organs of the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Quarterly Review, featured an article written by the editor. Now, the editor was thinking and talking about the status and future of Black people in America and abroad. And the title of the article is called Condition and Character of Negroes in Africa. And this was written by a guy named Theodore Dwight, who was a Northern lawyer. Dwight argued that Americans owed debts, quote, to Black people near and far for the, quote, wrongs inflicted on them for our benefit and because we generally neglect them, and still persist in denying to Negroes those intellectual faculties and moral qualities which the Creator has bestowed on the entire human family. And this article is really important because it shows how the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, at this time is starting to tickle the readers' minds by making them think about what are we going to do with these people after the war? How do we measure them up? How do we consider them? What do we think of them? What is their value? What is their potential? And so in the midst of the war's ups and downs and the nasty battles, it's really fascinating to find an article in a popular Methodist periodical that's trying to get readers to like wrap their minds around how Black people will fit in the future. And so for talks of having owed debts, so to speak, it does look favorably upon the Methodist Episcopal Church. And in addition to aiding the efforts of the AMA by sending bodies, books, and Bibles into contraband camps, the Methodist Church was, like I said, on a political campaign seeking a more secure future for Black people in America. Now, in this particular slide, we see the stirring words of a Union Army captain by the name of James F. Russling. Russling shared that he heard a high-ranking official arguing that Black people would, quote, be allowed to build our railroads, dig our canals, and ditch our swamps, but that when these public works are completed, they will be shipped off to Africa or Central America. In response to this, Russling said, "Faugh, let men remember that no nation ever yet willingly abandoned the defenders of its life," unquote. Captain Russling wanted his Methodist audience to realize that Black people were just as invested in war efforts as white people were. In recognizing their bravery and their resilience in defending and fighting for this country, Russling was making an argument for the future political status of Black men as citizens. For this piece to take center stage in the Methodist Quarterly Review suggests that the question as to the newly freed Black person's future status as an American was an extremely popular religious as well as intellectual topic for secular and religious bodies. And also want to highlight The role of the African Methodist Episcopal Church briefly. Here, free Black Northerners closely followed the events and laws that were passed during the Civil War. And they felt personally invested as well in ensuring a smooth transition to freedom for their Southern counterparts. The Christian Recorder, the official publishing organ of the AME Church, produced a telling article in its April 5th, 1862 issue. Almost 1 year after the war had been underway, members of the church wanted to rally as a community in doing their part to assist Union Army efforts. In a small note on the newspaper entitled Aid for the Contrabands, the editor informed the readers of the impressive efforts of Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The editor added, quote, that the members of Bethel Church on 6th Street, Philadelphia, are engaged in making up clothing for the contrabands. They're cutting and sewing day and night, up to 9 and 10 o'clock. We would recommend the different churches to pursue a similar course, quote unquote. It is really interesting to drop in at Bethel Church and see the activity of both males and females. Let all who want to give anything for this good cause come forward immediately, unquote. So the AME Church highlighted the communal efforts here of Bethel Church that brought men and women together, which is very impressive for this time, because usually during war efforts, especially as early as the Revolutionary War, it was common to have what we call spinning bees, where patriotic women would come together and they would sew clothes for American or for patriot soldiers, and that carried on into the Civil War. The making of clothes was generally a woman's job. And so it's really remarkable here in 1862 to see these almost sweatshop-like situations where these people are cutting and putting together clothes, and it's not just women, they're doing it from sunup to sundown. And for the editor of the newspaper to add this and to encourage other churches to do this, which we will assume that at least some did, it really speaks to how invested free Northern Black people were, Northern Black churches of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and surely other denominations were invested in sending materials and products and even people to the spaces where formerly enslaved people were. Okay, and so to witness that the men and women working together to making the clothing for contraband camp residents is really remarkable, and it shows widespread hope throughout the North that things will be better for Black people overall. So like the Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church was on a mission to ensure its readers, allies, and even enemies that contraband camp residents had the capacity and the support for civilization and citizenship. Early on, the Christian Recorder expressed concerns for the enslaved refugees who fled to the Union side. They were weary of if the contraband camps would even honor taking care of the refugees. Now, in this slide, an editor of the paper wrote, quote, that there has been considerable doubts, at least as to whether the contraband would be confiscating or not. Many believing that the government is so obligated to slavery and its advocates that it was really afraid to do even what it knew to be right and just in the sight of Almighty God. And also that the executors of the law err not faithfully carrying out their pledge to sustain and keep injustice to all mankind. And early on, if you remember, I told you about how early Southerners in the war could just go over to Union lines and reclaim enslaved people that tried to flee in hopes of freedom. And this is what the editor is talking about. But he goes on to say, however, on one evening of last week, the scales of doubt were thrown from many a mind's eye by the arrival in our city of 99 contrabands, being one less than 100. Therefore, there are no doubts as to whether they are free or not. One of their number was a woman 104 years old. The old lady, since she has gained her freedom, is full of joy to know that God has spared her life to see that day when she could say that she was not a thing, but a human being, and could now claim her freedom. The old lady walks and moves around as though she was about 20 years old. Elder Woodland was called upon to baptize some of the little children. And when he was about to perform that duty, we are told that the mother of one of these children ran out of doors. And some of the ladies tried to prevail on her to go back in the house. This lady did not know what they were going to do to her child. She did not know, and partly forgetting that she was now free, the old fear and dread of that oppression came over her. And such a thing as dedicating children to God, she had never heard of before. And hence, she knew nothing about it, having been kept in the dark as it relates to her duty to God, herself, and her children. Many, no doubt, who are enemies to our people hope to have much to say in relation to these contrabands being a burden and a nuisance in our midst. But we are proud to inform them when the 99 arrived and the news went about, the citizens threw open their doors and they were all well provided for. And ladies and gentlemen were riding about in the carriages to employ the men and women, unquote. So this article really speaks to the embrace of free Northern Black communities and the agenda that they had in pushing the ideas that these newly freed Black people wouldn't become nuisances or burdens, and that they would have a supporting community in free Blacks who would help employ and take care of them. And now we will spend the next few minutes turning away from really institutional responses at mission efforts, and we will focus on the efforts of individuals. Sarah Jane Foster was born in Gray, Maine in 1839. Foster worked as a missionary and teacher among the Contraband Camp residents of Martinsburg and Harpers Ferry, Virginia, on behalf of the American Missionary Association. Okay, Foster was a proud Baptist, and her missionary career ultimately encompassed travels from as far north as her native Maine and as far west as West Virginia. While working at Harper's Ferry, Foster wrote home to a friend about her hesitation to interact with camp refugees. This was early on in her camp work career. She soon asked her friend to pray for her that, quote, God will give me grace not to feel contempt for their emotional extravagance, unquote. Not only were these people overly emotional, but in the mind of Foster, all camp-free people were predictably the same. In one popular Free Will Baptist Church periodical, Foster wrote a letter to the readers, and she assured them of this generalization, saying, quote, my Northern friends need not think I have any difficulty in recognizing my flock, unquote. But beautifully, as Foster began working more with these people, many of her prejudices slipped away. At Harper's Ferry, Foster formed very meaningful relationships with several refugees of the camp. So much so that it soon became normal to see some of the Black men regularly escorting Foster to her home after a hard, long day of teaching. As she continued developing these relationships, she faced backlash not from the Black people she worked to teach, but from some of her fellow missionaries and family members. Some of Foster's white counterparts began spreading rumors. They inspired speculations that Foster was not white, but merely passed as a white woman. In response to this comment, the zealous missionary responded, quote, I hope they, Black people, will believe it, for then surely they could not complain of my teaching the people of my own race, unquote. Now, while traveling one day with a group of Black intellectuals on a Northern tour in 1867, Foster wrote of how nasty the prejudices of Northerners were against Black people. Family friends who were once the closest of allies to her were now distanced by her new affinity for Black people. After serving a number of years among them and watching camp residents learn, laugh, cry, pray, and share their stories, Foster had a transformative conversion experience. She was made into almost a new creature. And in an 1867 journal entry, Foster wrote in her diary, I thank God that I have a broader interest in humanity. God forgive me that I ever lacked it at all. Now I shall do all that I can henceforth to help the colored people rise, unquote. Foster would ultimately die in 1868 from yellow fever, which is one of the diseases I talked about being very common in these camp spaces. Next, we will talk about a woman named Lucy Chase. She was from Worcester, Massachusetts, and she traveled with her sister Sarah down to the South to aid in the education of freed people as well. At the onset of the Civil War, early on, Lucy and her sister wanted to work as nurses for the Union Army. Like Sarah Foster, Lucy also brought her own prejudices to the camps that she worked in. In one of her early letters to her mother and father, Chase wrote in a disgusted and almost horrifying tone, at one of their prayer meetings, which we attended last night, we saw a painful exhibition of their barbarism. Their religious feeling is purely emotional, void of principle and of no practical utility, unquote. Chase came into free people camps expecting all of the free people to be alike, just like Sarah Foster. Chase saw Black people as simple and one-dimensional. She went on to say in another diary entry that I, quote, notice as much individuality in the faces of Negroes as I do in those of the whites. But beautifully, like Foster, as Chase continued teaching and building relationships among these men, women, and children, she came to appreciate more of their culture. In one letter issued later, Chase noted how astonishing it was to sit in on one of their prayer meetings that at first she called barbaric. And it was now beautiful. She recalled sitting in and hearing how these, quote, wretched former slaves prayed for Black and white, for rich and poor, for bond and free, unquote. Sitting among these people and hearing their harrowing tales of life during slavery and hearing them pray for the very people who enslaved, beat, and decimated them softened the heart of Lucy Chase. In an 1863 letter, Chase added, quote, I can truly say, white man though I am, that I have, with the Negro, a feeling sense of this state of transition, lo, an episode. Every hour of my life here is strange. It is not the past, it is not the future, and with all the chances and changes of war, it does not seem to be the present either. Times were changing, and Lucy could feel something changing within her as well. Chase also recalled how Southern locals were not too fond of her radical conversion and the work that she was doing. She shared an encounter once that she had with a close neighbor, stating, quote, one of our mainland neighbors is disgusted at the very thought that anybody could be found so silly as to come all the way down here to teach the Negroes. She recalled this neighbor saying, I'd poison a Yankee in a moment if I could get a chance. Lucy would continue serving in the South as a freedmen's teacher and supervisor until 1869 in both Virginia and Florida. Finally, we turn to Susie King Taylor. Now, she was born in 1848 in Liberty County, Virginia, and she was a rare person because she came from a free Black Southern family, which was really rare in the South. About 5 to 7% of all Black people in the South were free. And so Susie's grandmother sent her off to live and learn from a family friend growing up, who taught her a lot of skills. She learned how to read and write, among those, which is also very rare because the majority of Black people in the South, especially during the time when she grew up, did not know how to read, and they legally could not know. And eventually Susie's skills became so refined that she was often known for writing passes, free passes, for all of the local Black people in her community in Georgia. And at this time, all Black people, of course, when she was doing this, free or enslaved, were required to carry passes with consent from their masters. And so she was a very pivotal person in the community that she grew up in. In 1862, like so many enslaved Blacks, Susie traveled with her uncle and family of 7 to Union lines. And it's important to note here that even if you weren't enslaved, it was in your best interest to travel and escape the Confederacy, because there were Southern soldiers and there were Southern civilians who were angry at losing their slaves, and they were taking out their anger on anyone Black, whether they were free or enslaved. And so Lucy traveled with her uncle and family of 7 to Union lines, and they eventually ended up at a place called St. Simon's Island, which was an island contraband camp in Georgia. While en route to the island, Susie encountered the captain of a Union steamboat, and he was fascinated by her. He inquired about her reading and writing skills and was shocked when she proved them to be true. He was astonished, since he did not know that any Black people in the South could read or write. Once word spread about Susie's intelligence, she was eventually given a leadership role teaching children how to read at St. Simon's Island. The class size was about 40 children. King recalled, quote, "I had about 40 children to teach, beside a number of adults who came to me nights, all of them so eager to learn to read above anything else," unquote. The St. Simon's Island camp held about 600 men, women, and children altogether, and life was very dangerous. With this being an amphibious post, the campsite lacked any soldiers on the ground. There were only Union Marines to protect the island. And so with this, many Confederate soldiers and civilians would often try to come to the outskirts of the post and snatch people away if they were able to do that. Susie lived a fascinating life as a spy, a nurse, and of course, a teacher for the Union Army. Her passion for educating people of her own community was often met with challenges resulting from King's gender and race. King wrote, "At the close of the war, my husband and I returned to Savannah. A number of the comrades returning at the same time. A new life was before us now, all the old life left behind. After getting settled, I opened a school at my home on South Broad Street, now called Oglethorpe Avenue, as there was not any public school for Negro children. I had 20 children at my school and received $1 a month for each pupil." Now, after about a year of the war, King went on to write, "On September 16, 1866, my husband, Sergeant King, died, leaving me to soon welcome a little stranger alone." Now, concerning King's loyalty to the government, she always acknowledged that, quote, "My interest in the boys in blue had yet not abated. I was still loyal and true, whether they were Black or white. My hands have never left undone anything they could do towards their aid and comfort in the twilight of their lives." King would spend the remainder of her life in Boston, Massachusetts. And finally, I want to end here because this is a great place to end and to continue discussion. And so I end with this slide because it marks the tone and the trajectory of American domestic missionary efforts. In the January 1866 issue of the Methodist Quarterly Review, the editor of the periodical, Reverend Dr. D.D. Whedon, made open attempts at brokering peace and unity between the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Reverend Whedon suggested that, quote, if our North and South are ever to attain the blessing of peace and oneness, the harmony must begin between the Northern and Southern churches. And this can be done only through the proper organs, the press, unquote. Whedon warned Northern Methodists from rashly rushing to judge Southern Methodist sentiments as one in the same with the agenda of, quote, Southern military authorities. Whedon went on to advocate for his Southern Methodists, adding that, quote, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, whatever its past animus, professes to renounce every thought inconsistent with future loyalty to our government and peace with our states and people. We second infer that toward the Negro, whatever the irreligious and politicians may do, Southern Methodists profess their purpose to be human, Christian, and parental, unquote. The reality here is clear. Domestic missions among newly enslaved people did indeed change the hearts and minds of many of the missionaries who worked among the camps. But for many others, North and South, hearts and minds concerning the potential for Black people as citizens and respectable equals was still quite stony. And one of the most brutal and destructive eras, the Jim Crow era, would be born out of it. While Reverend Whedon saw hope for unity and togetherness among white Methodists, there was a different reality for Black people like Susie King Taylor. Her words, perhaps here, are the best way to end. After publishing her memoir nearly 40 years after Whedon's optimistic plea for unity and Southern Methodist love and respect for rights and human dignity, Taylor issued her verdict. She said, in this land of the free, we are burned, tortured, and denied a fair trial, murdered for any imaginary wrong conceived in the brain of the Negro-hating white man. There is no redress for us from a government which promised to protect all under its flag. It seems a mystery to me. They say one nation, one flag, one country, indivisible. Is this true? Can we say this truthfully when one race is allowed to burn, hang, and inflict the most horrible torture weekly, monthly on another? No, we cannot sing "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." It is hollow mockery. The Southland laws are all on the side of the white, and they do just as they like to the Negro, whether in the right or not. And so with that, I will now open it up for a conversation. Any thoughts, comments?
Wow. You said at the beginning that we would learn something, and you're absolutely right. I had never heard of the contraband camps. And what a story. Thank you. And I'm also very impressed with how you were able to find a lot of this information in newspapers, like these articles and things in the newspapers. I've done some family genealogy, and I have found some information about family members through old newspapers, and it's kind of funny. The writing style, is very different in the old newspapers than what we look at being a newspaper here, and often the information I found was often in a gossip column, basically, and they would say who's visiting and who's gone on a trip and just all kinds of crazy stuff. It's like, why are you reporting this in the newspaper? But I guess, there wasn't a lot of other stuff going on, but it's so impressive to see all this information that you have pulled out of the newspapers and put this story together. So thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you.
So Shakeel, I'm Henry Perry. That was really fabulous. And it was very exciting to learn these new things. I guess my question is what you're sharing with us broadly known among academics who study this kind of thing? And are you writing a book on this? And are you uncovering new nuances to all of this? I'm curious to sort of how this is in the academic world. And are you going to make a book out of this, or is this like an article that you're working on? It's very, very, very well done in so many different ways, and you presented it so well too. So really want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that, for saying that. But yeah, so the purpose of this research is really to aid in the formation of my dissertation. My dissertation the title of it is called Test of Faith, Race, Religion, and Gender During the Civil War. So all of this information will reappear in my work. And it's not commonly known, it's just specific to what I study. And so I hope to write more about it. And I'll have a chapter in my dissertation on missionary efforts and race. So this is completely Shakeel thing. It's not a common thing. Yep.
That's exciting. So I guess one other quick question which comes to mind, of course, is as you're working on all this, and we're watching before our very eyes today all these remnants of racism and how durable they've been throughout the decades and the centuries. What are your own thoughts about what we can do today in America to overcome this stain, this countrywide stain that people more and more are aware of that they hadn't been so aware of in the past? And what's the relevance of what you're doing to help us today and other people like us today who are trying to think through, and leaders who are going to be addressing these issues over the next couple of decades?
Absolutely, that's a great question. The words of Christ actually come to mind. I immediately think of Christ talking to an audience saying, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy, but my burden is light." And I believe that Christ is calling for us as believers of whatever color we are to take on the yoke of learning of people who do not look, act, believe, sound, think like us. And that when we do that, we take on a burden, but it's a burden that we have been designed and enabled by God to carry. And so for me, I think that we need to have spaces where people are interacting. And when I was reading and talking about the roles of missionaries who came in with prejudices, but after spending sincere time interacting and learning from the people, their hearts changed. And I think that in order to create that type of inward work, there has to be a space where we allow ourselves to learn from one another. And whatever that space look like depends on church leaders. You know, what type of spaces are you creating? What type of environments are you crafting and cultivating for that inward work of change, that spirit prompted work to happen? And so I think the impetus is on church leadership and on willing people to go into these spaces and be willing to take on the burden of the other, of learning about the other, of experiencing the life trials and stories of the other. And I think that it'll make all of us in our society better overall if we do that.
That was great. Thank you.
Elizabeth, you have your hand up?
Thank you. Yeah, if I might just piggyback on Mr. Perry's question. I had so many other questions about your talk, your fabulous presentation, but if I just may piggyback on Mr. Perry's question about what can I as a white person do in terms of progressing anti-racism work? And I think you probably answered that, but just if that makes sense, the question
Yeah,
I'm asking.
no, it does. So one of the first things that you can do, as whatever color you are, if you're a believer in Jesus, ask God to let you be light. You know, the Bible talks about how God is love, but God is also light, and light drives out darkness just by virtue of being itself. So you don't have to like put on a cape and say, I'm anti-racist and I'm a Black ally. You can if you want to. That would be really different. I mean, and that could be effective. But what we need to focus on being, we have to be lights in darkness. So, and what that means is, if you really want to promote anti-racist works, when you get in spaces around people who are racist or who do racist things, be light. Drive out the darkness. You know, it may not be going to a protest rally. It may not be doing some grand extravagant thing on TV. But if you have loved ones in your family who you know exhibit racist tendencies, your work starts with being a light at home easily. And I think oftentimes we get caught up in trying to do things on a grand scale. We want to affect the world, but our first ministry as believers is to really impact those around us. And that's how the faith spread. It didn't get spread by the king in the beginning, by high ruling governments, but it got spread by these individuals who had personal encounters with Jesus, and they were just so blown away. And even though Jesus said, hey, I'm going to heal you, I'm going to do this for you, but I don't want you to tell anybody, he knew they were going to tell people. I mean, but the fact is that those experiences made the faith what it is. And so an anti-racist work has to follow the parallels of Jesus's ministry, I believe. And so that starts with those individual encounters, those individual experiences, being a light in dark places around you immediately. And when you do that, you'll do so much more good to contribute to the works of bringing down the principality of racism. I mean, and of course, it's still good to be vocal on like national levels and finding out what's going on in communities around you, but you want to make sure that you're a light right in your home front, right in your home space first.
Thank you so much. I have one, I know that we're totally out of time, but I had one question and I can email you later, but the Susie King Taylor, is just amazing that in her time period, that it sounded like she was an entrepreneur almost opening this school, in addition to the many other roles that she wore. And my question, and I will email you later because I know we're out of time, but did Harriet Tubman, did she have any communication in your knowledge of, were Harriet Tubman and she kind of in communication? Because I know later on in life, Tubman opened a home for homeless Blacks in New York. So I was just wondering if yeah, thank you.
So as far as the research that I've done, I haven't found any connections, but I've got to believe that they're definitely there, because a lot of the free Black people, especially if they were prominent or had major roles, they were connected to each other. Like they're through like the newspaper organs and through different associations. A lot of these people were connected. So I will actually make a note to look that up, because that would be cool to kind of reference in my work. But I haven't seen it, but I believe that it's there. Anyone else?
I was really encouraged by the way you saw the church involved, although, you know, falteringly in some ways, but to be able to look back on that and see some of that in history. Also wanted to just say that I've just recently watched the PBS special on the Black church, and Gates takes us through some really interesting development there. And what my hope would be as a Christian is that we could bring the church back into the conversation more effectively in the time we're in. I think one of his fears, as he talked about that, is that part of the modern anti-racist movement is not as connected with the church. And I think your research can help us in that regard. Understanding that it's still flawed in so many ways, but as believers to still hope that the church has a role to play here.
That's a really good point.
I appreciate all the food for thought you've shared with us. I guess like maybe everybody among us. I had not heard of Contraband Camps before, and it struck me as sort of odd name that, if you're trying to help somebody, you would give the collection of people a name that's sort of shameful, but I was just trying to make sure I hadn't missed some nuance of meaning, and at a glance saw that one meaning of contraband is something that should not be possessed or sold. And hey, for that, it's right on. But for most of, at least my intuitive leaps, that's a very negative word to use for something that in its best case was well-intentioned and I presume life-saving.
Yeah, it's fascinating, that word. And it really, like I said earlier, it was birthed out of the Lincoln administration's tactical approach from a military perspective, thinking about the role that these people would play and their importance to the Confederate Army and to the Confederate nation. And so it was really like a tactical military term to use. But it's very, and that's a really good point, is that contraband, the way we think of contraband today, is like those are items that you're not supposed to have and that you can be penalized for having. I mean, and it's really interesting how they're items, that's kind of one of the things is that throughout American history, Black people have fought against being objectified instead of humanized. And so that's kind of a driving theme, even with that.
I know we're out of time, and I guess I can always follow up with you privately, but I guess you've given us the snapshot of kind of a point in time, especially where the church is. Ken's talking about the church, the Methodist church in particular. And I guess I'm wondering, kind of thinking forward, if some of the words, some of the push by some people within the church, what impact that ultimately had on the church going forward with respect to race. I mean, you strategically picked out missionaries who had a conversion experience. I'm a Baptist, and so I've done a little research and have read some articles about how some of the missionaries who came down were not converted. While they came down to do mission work, they still had this notion of one of the articles I read, because I was looking it back up as you were talking, Black inadequacy and white supremacy were kind of the bedrock of still what their mission efforts. So I'm wondering to what degree, and this, like I said, this is the next presentation. What degree did that impact the impact of some of those missionaries who were converted, and the people, like I want to get that quote that you read in the conclusion of that, near the conclusion, about how people, you picked out the positive people, whether or not they had any impact, or to what degree they had impact after this period. We know the Reconstruction and Jim Crow that kind of launched out of this period, right. But I'm wondering within the church, where these people were talking, to what degree they had any influence in the church. Clearly, the Methodists were ahead of some of the other white denominations in America. But I'm just wondering about that in terms of what was the next piece? I guess that's a chapter in the dissertation too.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's brilliant. So the work that I have read by historians on Reconstruction, so the church really does mirror society. There's this period of Reconstruction that happens in the beginning, that happens even in churches. One historian named Daniel Stoll, he wrote a really great book called Rebuilding Zion, and he looks at the trajectory of these efforts. And so early on, when the Union Army came in to take over areas so that they could make sure that Black people could vote and could make sure they were treated fairly and things like that, Union Army people also took over churches. And they even transferred ownership of some of these churches into Black people's hands. So it's really fascinating. But when Reconstruction fails, literally, the people who once had ownership in these churches, and this is very common, the Black people who once owned these churches now no longer, they don't own the churches anymore. And this is very common throughout the Reconstruction era South. Like after Reconstruction failed, gains that were made within organizations for Black people, within the white organizations and stuff, they really were scaled back. And it's really interesting because one of the articles that I used today featured a guy. He was being really optimistic and saying, well, if we're going to get unity, and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, they're going to respect Black people and they're just going to follow all the rules. And of course they don't. Like that's, so the gag on all of this is that we know what's going to happen. It's like it's like watching a movie at the end of the movie and you know what happens time-wise after the movie ends and you're like, oh man, this is going to end badly. I mean, and that's kind of what it does, because we know that Jim Crow rises and the church is a primary organ for Jim Crow power. And what we also need to realize is that after the Civil War, everyone was just tired of division. And so a lot of white unity came at the behest of people who wanted to just be done with anything divisive. So that meant putting race on the back burner. It meant reuniting over our whiteness and letting these Black people, work with the hand they're dealt with. And so unity here, the idea of a progressive, united front among whites really hurt the progress that could have been made among Blacks.
That's a good softball teeing up, right?
Thank you, sis. I appreciate it.
We look forward to learning more from our history so that we can make the next rhymes or repetitions in this cycle come out better, we hope. Let's take a moment to thank Shakeel Harris for this wonderful morning.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.